So good morning to everybody. We are now to our second day and second session of our third session of our program about commercial strategies, and we have 4 presentations. We are more or less concentrating in the 18th century, but not only, and also early modern period. And we are covering all Europe fast. Okay, we begin with Pascale Gorguet-Ballesteros and Moïra Dato. Pascale is chief curator of the 18th century dress department at Palais Galliera. She is a lecturer in textile, fashion, and dress history. And Dr. Moïra Dato is specialized in textile history. Her PhD researches are concerning the market of Lyonnais silks in Italy in the 18th century through an economic and cultural lens. Everybody has 20 minutes. Please respect the time, and you can present your presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I will try first to share my own PowerPoint, right?
Can you move it? Yes, okay. Then you can begin.
Okay, thank you.
Good luck.
Good morning, everyone. Very happy, Pascale and I, to join you today and present you our work, which is a case study focused on one specific garment, the male waistcoat. We will have first an overview of the topic as explained in our draft paper, but we will especially today discuss the methodology and challenges of this study. So how did we come to focus on just one garment? It's been a process which I will try to briefly explain now. For my thesis, I work on the commerce and consumption of Lyonnais silks in the 18th century. The city of Lyon in France had a manufacture of silk fabrics, which was one of the most prominent in Europe in the 18th century. Its production, carried within the framework of a silk weaving guild, was exported throughout Europe and beyond. And for my thesis, I am focusing on the Italian market. So going through sources such as account books or correspondence of Lyonnais merchants, something caught my attention. Usually in this type of documentation, fabrics are written down following a certain standard, a succinct description of the fabric, the pattern design number, so the number referring to the design which has a pattern of the fabric, the number of Ls, the L being the unit used to measure the length of fabrics, the price per L, and the total price. However, some sources showed something different. I found in some merchants' books and correspondence many mentions of vest, which means waistcoats, sometimes with indication of the number of Ls, but most of the time without, and the price then is per waistcoat, not per L. It is curious, as traditionally Lyonnais silks are sold in length of fabric, and only later on transformed into garments by specialized artisans that are not part of the Lyonnais silk weaving guild. The Lyonnais manufacturer does not sell already made clothes. So how come some merchants wrote in their account books that they sold waistcoats, some being even indicated as already embroidered? That left me puzzled. And it is by looking into museum collections that I found the answer. I saw panels of fabric, as you can see here, woven or embroidered already in the shape of the intended garment. Ready to be cut and assembled, this type of waistcoat is called in museums à disposition in French or in shape in English. Talking about that with Pascale Gorguet-Ballesteros, she told me that not only some uncut waistcoats in shape survive, but some museums, such as the Palais Galliera, have a substantial number of them. So this would indicate that this typology of waistcoat was not on the fringe limited type of production, but rather a popular phenomenon. This type of garment is very interesting as it shows early stages of ready-to-wear production. The development of the ready-to-wear industry, however, being commonly attributed to the 1840s. Clothes manufactured in shape have appeared much earlier, however, as historiography has shown with shirts or petticoats. We don't know much, however, on the manufacture of waistcoats in shape, which is why, with Pascale, we decided to combine our knowledge and information and compare different material, visual, printed, and written sources to investigate it.
So in France, we had a true French waistcoat craze at the 18th century. Next. As the Baron of Oberkirch explained in 1787 when she was in Paris, of course, beautiful fabrics and diamonds were still very much important and expressing luxury and wealthiness, but also men were fancying singularities, and it was very trendy to have hundreds of waistcoats if you wanted to be said that you are fashionable. These waistcoats were embroidered with hunting patterns or with cavalry fights patterns or naval fights. And also we know that we have a lot of other kinds of patterns, and they were very, very expensive. Next. So this waistcoat success is proved in the Palais Galliera Fashion Museum of the city of Paris, where we have 399 waistcoats, which is almost a quarter of the whole 18th century garment collection, which is composed by 1,883 garments, and the collection of the male garments, also about 900 dress. So the waistcoat is more than a third of this collection. In addition, our collection is completed by 179 watercolored drawings used as models for waistcoat embroideries. Waistcoats and drawings are abundant not only in Galliera, but also in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs collection, in the Musée des Tissus de Lyon for France, and of course abroad, Metropolitan Cooper Hewitt collection in Catalonia, in Barcelona, in the Design Museum, in the archives, where everywhere in all big collections you have waistcoats, not to say drawings. Next. And here you can see a drawing from our collection with indication given to the embroiderers and a sample, a woven sample for a waistcoat preserved in the Musée des Tissus de Lyon. And these samples were used by the merchants to show to the customers which kind of waistcoat they had, and they had very often numbers, and then it was easier during the selling process to know which kind of waistcoats the customers wanted. Next. But in French, we have a terminology problem since we have two words, veste and gilet, for one English word, waistcoat. Traditionally, it is said that veste means a male top with sleeves used in the first half of the 18th century, while gilet without sleeves are in use in the second half of the 18th centuries. However, French commissions have orders for gilet in the 20s and veste in the 70s. Next. So in the dictionary of Antoine Furtière of 1690, we can see that a veste is an undergarment worn under the coat, what we call in French the habit. More or less 80 years later, in his Art du Tailleur, François-Alexandre de Garceau stated that we have two words, we have veste and we have gilet, and veste would be with sleeves and gilet without sleeves.
Excuse me, Pascale, can you put yourself some lower, because we don't see you totally. We see only your mouth. Can you move yourself? But if it is not possible, okay.
I can put me like that.
So okay.
Can you see me better?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Yes, sorry for my chair. So but you can understand me. You can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. So in 1771, the 5th edition of the dictionary from Trévoux only repeats the definition of Furtière for veste, but there is a separate entry for gilet. And clearly we understand that a gilet is a kind of underwear which were worn under the shirt or above the shirt to be protected against cold, and that a gilet has clearly no sleeves. So the gilet testifies the fashion in the third quarter of the century to wear intimate outfits as outerwear, what we call in French la mode du déshabillé or du négligé. Next. So clearly this art collector, Abraham Fontanelle, who a very wealthy man, has chosen to be depicted with a gilet under his shirt. And you can see that it is a kind of very intimate and official portrait, stating this very relaxed and very refined way of having intimate outfits, but of course, officially. Next. So gilets are more fashionable at the end of the century than vests, but vests are ordered during all the century. The success of the waistcoat then has been constant during all the century, amplified and renewed at the end of the century by a cut related to newest fashion. Curiously, in their accounts, Italian merchants order more vests than gilets. In addition, in Italian, the terminology is even less fixed than in French. The terms sottoveste, camisete, vesti or vestiti were used depending on the place and person writing down the accounts. Next. So, as Moïra said, we have in Italian commissions very much vest said à bordure. So what are vestes à bordure? Next. So let us state that since we are in the silk world, patterns could be woven or embroidered. Next. Waistcoats could be bought in a certain length of fabric with a ground pattern. So it was, you just bought the fabric, give this to the tailor, and the tailor cut and sew the waistcoat. Next. But of course, as demonstrated yet Moïra, you can buy a certain length of fabric with an in-shape pattern, un décor placé or un décor à disposition in French. And this pattern was located according to the places when it will be when the waistcoat is definitely made. So this pattern is located along the edges of the fronts, on the pockets, and sometimes we have small motifs scattered on the fronts. So the bordure, of course, are the edges. But when you have a veste à bordure, you don't know if it is an embroidered waistcoat or if it is a woven waistcoat. For this, you need more information. Next. The in-shape waistcoats could be sold according to two methods. You could have one front above the other one, as in the yellow example, where you have the left front and above it there is the right front, or you could have the two fronts on the same L. Next. When the numbers of L's are indicated in commissions, then it is possible to guess that the waistcoat has its two fronts on the same length of fabric, because of course it was sold. What was sold was less L's than when it is a in-shape pattern with one front above the other one. So this means an economy of fabric and also a way of selling more waistcoats. And as pointed yet with Moïra, it was very easy for this waistcoat to be exported. And we are here at the very beginning of a ready to wear. Next. If Galliera is also here today, it is because we have in the collection material traces of Lyonnaise waistcoat exportations, most particularly to Italy. Next. So we have two in-shape waistcoats, and you know yet one, but you have also a blue one, and these two waistcoats, each of them has two seals. One of these seals are seals from the royal customs, and the other seals is a proof, is a stamp, proving that the waistcoats were made in Lyon. Indeed, all silks fabric going out of France for exportation has to go through the royal custom, which was set in Lyon. Next. Plus, we have in the collection this wonderful waistcoat, which was made by Lyonese manufacturer, par la Fabrique Lyonnaise. So it's too long to develop this, but of course, we know this by comparison and by work with a Lyonese colleague. This wonderful waistcoat with this woven pattern, silk and metallic thread patterns, is coming from the Prince de Ligne family, so a prestigious family in the European aristocracy. Next. And we have in the Museo Correr in Venice the same waistcoat, a waistcoat with the same pattern. It's not exactly the same waistcoat because, as you have noticed, our waistcoat has sleeves and the Italian ones has no sleeves. For we have a vest and Venezia has a gilet. And this gilet, according to the colleague from Venezia, is coming from a patrician Venetian family. Next. So this is a story without word. It's for you.
Okay, I take over. So these exportations are confirmed by the account books and correspondence of Lyonnais merchants, where we can see that Lyon sent to Italy many waistcoats, especially from the 70s. This success could be explained, of course, by the place of fashion in the Lyonnais merchant strategies. Historiography has demonstrated that since the late 17th century, the Lyonnais used seasonal fashion changes with new patterns put on the market on a regular basis as a strategy to foster consumption as well as to prevent copying by rival manufacturers. However, from the 1770s, fashion turned away from woven patterns towards embroidered ones. The Lyonnais strategy devised around the making of woven patterns couldn't work with this new trend. Embroideries were done on plain or small patterned fabrics, but most importantly, in that case, the fashionable nature of the fabric came from the embroideries, not the ground fabric itself. An embroidery was traditionally carried out outside of the silk weaving guild. The Lyonnais had therefore no control over it and became limited to the sole production of simpler fabrics. Without the seasonal changes of fashionable patterns, they did not have the upper hand over rival manufacturers anymore. Especially in the case of Italy, which manufacturers have been important producers of plain or small patterned silks throughout the 18th century. With this new trend, there was no more reasons for consumers to favor Lyonnais silks over Italian ones. And as the Lyonnais complained themselves, the new trend for embroideries was therefore detrimental to them. However, once you consider the waistcoat, you can see that this narrative is not entirely correct. If a number of merchants certainly suffered from this turn of fashion, others managed to adapt to it by incorporating embroidery in their production. And this was made possible by focusing on the manufacturing of waistcoats embroidered in shape. They commissioned themselves their silks to be decorated by embroiderers instead of leaving that final stage to the mercer or the merchant embroiderer once the fabric was woven. Having also the making of embroideries under their supervision, they therefore had control over the fashion of embroidery, commissioning new patterns to Lyonnais designers specifically for those embroideries, and they could therefore rely on their old strategy of regular fashion changes to keep an upper hand on this market. And it is a strategy that seemed to have worked, as demonstrated by the many Italian commissions of embroidered waistcoats they receive. Furthermore, by comparing the commissions of Italian mercers with the ones from Parisian mercers, we can see a quite telling difference. While commissions from Paris always came with a design reference number or with a sample, indicating that designs or samples had been previously circulated and a selection had been made from them, Italian commissions of waistcoats often came without any design number or sample. They only specified the type of fabric they wanted, so tabby, couture, satin, the color, if metallic threads were to be used, and if the edges and pockets should be embroidered, but no indication whatsoever on the pattern. The only request regarding the design is that it had to be new, at the latest fashion, ad ultimo gusto. This is very interesting because it indicates that these Italian mercers did not make a prior selection from the Lyonnais production, but apparently trusted them to send embroidered waistcoats at the latest fashion. This demonstrates that despite this new trend for embroidery, Lyon was still able to adapt and use fashion as an efficient tool to keep and develop their commerce, the case of the Italian commissions of waistcoats being a very good example. Following these preliminary conclusions, needless to say that the study of waistcoats came with some challenges for us. First, the identification of waistcoats in shape in written sources is difficult, as they are never indicated as such. As we have seen, there is no standardized terminology, descriptions are often very succinct, and there is quite a disparity between merchants' books. It is never indicated when they are woven or embroidered in shape. It is only written vest or sottoveste in Italian, as you can see on this example. Sometimes with a number of L, sometimes without. Sometimes, as we saw, it is written à bordure, so with edges, which would indicate the presence of patterns made in shape, but it could also indicate the presence of trimmings. So even that is not always certain, which makes the identification and therefore quantification of waistcoats in shape difficult. Furthermore, it is a production and commerce that is not clearly delimited. It is very fluid and encompasses many different actors. Waistcoats could be made and sold by mercers, milliners, marchands de mode, embroiderers, and merchant manufacturers, without mentioning second-hand dealers, of course, which makes it a bit difficult sometimes to grasp. Another point that is left unresolved is why the production of embroidered waistcoats developed so much in comparison with other garments, such as dresses. Lyon did manufacture embroidered dress panels or coats, but it is nothing compared to the production of embroidered waistcoats. And there are also a number of points that still need to be further developed, which we haven't yet been able to do properly, partially due to these difficulties. First, an investigation of prices would be a good way to better understand this production. But taking only written sources, it does not tell much, because we see waistcoats with similar descriptions sold at different prices. And it is by combining the sources with surviving garments that we can have an idea of where this difference comes from, and therefore of the wide variety of waistcoats that was manufactured, with more or less complex patterns, a varied use of metallic threads, of colors, etc. A preliminary analysis has shown that despite the frequent use of metallic threads, which would make them more expensive, some Lyonnais waistcoats were sold in Italy at quite a low price, especially when compared to the aristocratic consumption of Paris. It is possible that with the embroidered waistcoat, the Lyonnais managed to expand their range of prices and then possibly their range of consumers, notably through lower costs of production, offering fashionable new garments at a low price. However, determining the cost of production is difficult as it differs greatly depending on the type of fabric and garment made. Although we would expect woven patterns to be more expensive to weave than plain or simple pattern fabrics than embroidered, some accounts books say the contrary, and that is because of the wide variety of techniques and quality that existed. A small pattern fabric could be more expensive to manufacture if made with more complex techniques, more colors, or more metallic threads, which are more delicate to handle. This variety makes it overall difficult to analyze the numbers and make a general statement on the cost of production, but we do hope to be able to expand on that aspect in the final draft of our paper. We also encountered some difficulties of comparing this with the Italian local production and commerce of waistcoats. Also because it's been a bit more difficult, of course, to access archives for the past year. We haven't yet found traces of waistcoats made in shape in Italy. For now, I have looked in Florence, and the only trace of embroidered waistcoats manufactured in shape that I found were in the account books of a Lyonnais merchant based in Florence. Account books of Florentine settioli or mercers do not have indications of waistcoats made in shape, but that could also be a question of transcription, of terminology. The information collected are not extensive enough yet to jump to such a conclusion, especially since we have a surviving garment such as this one. So you can see it's embroidered in shape, and it is bearing Italian seals from Milan and Parma, which would indicate perhaps an Italian production for the domestic market, so maybe made in Milan for Parma. So overall, you can see that this paper is a preliminary study. It serves as an introduction to this national and international craze for waistcoat. We thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this interesting paper, and very nice presented. I tell you that in Greek we have the word gilet until now for the without sleeves. So we are proceeding now to our second paper, Daniel Minos Navarro, The Virus of Fashion, Democratization in Luxury and New Commercial Strategies in Early Modern Valencia. Daniel is a doctor for modern history at the University of Valencia. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm preparing my presentation. 1 minute. Good morning. Buongiorno a tutti. First of all, start my presentation. I would like to thank the organization for making possible this meeting in such difficult situation. I'm sure that it was not so easy, and well, I want to show my greetings for this possibility. Well, let's go. As the presenter said, my paper is entitled The Virus of Fashion, Democratization of Luxury and New Commercial Strategies in Early Modern Valencia. And this paper intends to analyze how the influence of fashion in 18th century Spain transformed the commercial structure, being the petty bourgeoisie and the main protagonist, and the botiga, the shop, the priority background of these changes. For this, we will focus on 18th century Valencia as a case study, a dynamic city that experienced a remarkable economic development during this century, thanks to the rise and later the fall of the silk industry and all the industrial revolution that brought with it. Well, I intend to analyze the commercial dynamics of textile shopkeepers called mercaderes de vara or mercaderes de puerta abierta, mercanti al tallo, it was the translation, of Valencia through the judicial, the one hand, the judicial registers, and in the other hand, the fiscal registers that I present in the following slides. Distinguishing different commercial strategies in which the influence of new fashion and democratization of the luxury are keys, at least in my opinion. Likewise, through an intense tracking of the Valencian documentary sources, we have been able to compile around 50 probate inventories of Valencian shopkeepers during the whole century, through which we will analyze the evolution of the textile supply in the first half of the century and in the second half of the century, because this process will be changing. Well, finally, we will construct and present a price indexes of the most common textiles goods, trying to compare their evolution with the evolution of basic products, mainly wet, in order to corroborate the hypothesis of a generalized decrease in the prices of textiles goods, which contributed to increase the demand of the consumers. This is more or less the main idea of my presentation. Okay, let me introduce this brief citation that, in my opinion, reflects one of the central ideas of my paper. It's a citation of this book, Buyers and Sellers, that I'm sure that everyone knows. The dawn of a consumer society needed the development of retail infrastructures, organizations, and practices that made possible the distribution, marketing, and selling of a growing range of luxury and exotic goods. To sum up, we can say that consumption and commercialization are two sides of the same coin, and we need to explore more deeply this link, at least for the Spanish historiography or history of consumption, that commercialization was a little less developed research. Well, the index or the main parts of my presentations are here. There are four great parts and closing remarks, but I move on the presentation. The first part I entitled as Shops and the Showcase of Fashion, and there was the city of Valencia, as I said, the case study that I present during the long 18th century, because the chronology is not strict, concentrated in the 18th century. Let's see. Well, the first part. I have to say that it is not a new argument to relate the rise in the textile trade, retail trade, and the processes of economic growth. Pierre Vilar, in his classic work of 18th century Catalonia, the middle of the 20th century, put the accent on this connection, highlighting the role that this trade played in the accumulation of capital and the creation of modern trade companies and dynamic mercantile bourgeoisie. However, this process was not exclusive to the Catalan area and has also been present in other Mediterranean cities such as Madrid, Marseille, Naples, Cadiz, or Valencia, as I will present today. Undoubtedly, fashion stimulated economic growth, not only in the more developed regions of northwestern Europe. This process of economic and social transformation was also present in the Mediterranean context, as I think that I have shown in some previous publications. Well, we have this case study. The city of Valencia participated very actively in this process, developing an important sector of petty bourgeoisie and a change in the consumption patterns among a wider part of its population participate of this expansion of the consumption. Well, we have an image of the city. We know that it's a port city with increased maritime connection in the 18th century, but also with a dynamic market that connects with the inland trade. Okay. The idea is to understand the new commercial strategies developed by shopkeepers in the long 18th century Valencia in order to adapt their textile supply to the fashion tyranny with committees. We can see, and this is one of the of the questions. We can see new consumption patterns in a city in decline. Well, we will see. I said this city in decline because the silk industry, that was the main industrial activity of this city and his surroundings, was in crisis at least from the last quarter of the 18th century as a consequence of fashion. We can ask if fashion is only an economic engine or also a factor of crisis. In the case of Valencia, we can see both situations. I try to demonstrate in my presentation. Well, to do this, we first of all we explore the fiscal registers of the General of TAI, as I will present in the next slides. But I think that we could say some words about commercialization and textile supply in Valencia at the end of the 17th century. We can say that until the mid-17th century, textile supply was controlled by corporations, by guilds, and the main part of the textile market was controlled by the producers. Until this moment, we can say that conspicuous consumption or luxury was limited to the elite. That was an idea that will change in the next decades. Obviously, we can we can see that in this moment, in the 16th and the 17th century, there were shops in the city, but there were not an internal organization of the shopkeepers, and the textile supply of these shops are unspecific and combine retail and wholesale trade. By this, that I said that the textile supply mainly was controlled by textile guilds. But this situation was changing at the end of the 17th century. Before the War of Spanish Succession, we can see a progressive enlargement of the retail trade and also a supply diversification in the shops and in the activity of shopkeepers. Let's go to the next slide. For example, we use this figure to show that said the evolution of the income of general or this tax General del TAI. That is as a specific tax on the textile consumption that charge a 5% of the value of any sale in the city. And we can see that in the last quarter of the 70s, we can a very expansive trend of the consumption. We can see until 1705 or the years previous of the war, when we saw a decline in the income of this tax. Well, post-war and in the second half of the 18th century, we can identify a social consolidation of this group, these shopkeepers, and the first attempt of internal organization and collective defense of their interests of this group. We can see also a more specialized textile supply and the construction of different types of shops. To sum up, I think that we can affirm that there was an emergence of a mature consumer society in the 18th century Valencia, a permanent supply for a wider demand. I try to demonstrate with the next information. We have seen this figure. Well, the textile supply in one of these years, the last 1704, show that, for example, a wide range of textiles, almost 40 different types of fabrics distributed between wool and silk. Unfortunately, other fibers like linen are tax-free because are dedicated to wear poor people and are exempt of this tax. That limited our information, but we can see these two main fibers, wool and silk. The sample is, in my opinion, representative of the situation, because we create a database with almost 24,000 sales for only 1 year, and we can see this increased variety of textiles. The registers, the fiscal registers, have a limited information about the quality, the color, but are the main sources for the beginning of the 18th century. Well, what we did was focus our interest in 3 of the main shopkeepers' families in order to corroborate the ideas that I have presented. We concentrate in these 3 shopkeepers' family that were active in the retail trade at least for 20 or 30 years. And in the case of, for example, of these friend merchants, Zumbiela, were active for more than a century. And we can show that the trend, this expansive trend, is the same or almost the same in the 3 cases. Well, an increase in the number of jars sold from during the last quarter of the 17th century and the beginning of 18th century. Well, if we analyze the textile supply of these 3 shops, we can see that a positive trend also in the length for any sale in yards or varas that pass for 2 yards or 2 varas to more than 3 in these 20 years, and also an increase in the average price for any vara or for any yard. Obviously, these are averages, no? In Valencian currency. The price is increased slowly, but there is an evolution, a positive evolution. If we analyze the number of different fabrics in these 3 shops, we confirm the same trend. For example, Casamayor from 19 different types of textiles to almost 40 in 20 years. 26 in the case of Zambiela, for 36, and the same for Luesma. This, I think that these 3 specific cases reflects the general situation of shopkeepers at the beginning of 18th century. Well, in the case of Zumbiela's family, or Zumbiela's shop, we can analyze also the probate inventory of Bernardo Zumbiela, the son of one of these shopkeepers in 1745, that show a more complete vision of their textile supply. That includes not only wool and silk, but also linen and other fashionable objects. As we can see, the wool dominate with half of the length in yards, but also linen has an important part in this textile supply, more or less a third of the total. And silk was a reduced part in the length, but an important part in the value, because of the prices of silks and linen. Okay. Moving on in my presentation, I tried to define the main commercial strategies of these shopkeepers, and that transformate the social and economic of the city. First of all, as I said, we saw a diversification of textile supply, a greater variety of typologies, wool, silk, and also linen, a growing range of qualities, colors, and designs. We can see this especially with the probate inventories, not in the fiscal registers that I said that the information is poor in these registers, and we can define this textile supply as lighter, affordable, and trendy fabrics. Shopkeepers try to adapt their textile supply to the new consumption patterns that are present, that were present in the city of Valencia at the beginning of 18th century. The transformation of this retail trade change, an important change in my opinion, that is the decline of other different retail trade circuits. For example, the decline of fairs and markets to selling good textiles, the second-hand market, or, for example, the peddlers. Different activities that were in crisis at the beginning of the 18th century. And at the same time, the first attempts to develop an internal organization of these shopkeepers. Finally, in the second half of the century, create their own guild, and a specific merchant guild for shopkeepers. Also, the development of these commercial networks link the city with the inland of Spain, with different commercial diasporas and the integration between urban and rural areas. But this process has had important resistances and generated conflicts with the other agents or the other actors of the textile market in Valencia. First of all, we can define three great conflicts. The opposition and judicial litigation by textile guilds, because the artisans that control the textile market until the mid-17th century tried in the 18th century to supervise and control the commercial activities of shopkeepers. They defend their privileges, their ordinances through the courts. And these were a constant litigation between shopkeepers and different textile guilds. Second, internal competition among shopkeepers. For example, French shopkeepers, for example, Zumbiela, try to monopolize retail trade and exclude of this market their main competitors that were Maltese merchants. Even they tried or they defined a project for spatial exclusion of these merchants through a new ordinances that finally were modified. And third of these great conflicts, the distrust of political authorities. There was a context of rejection or distrust. We can define as distrust of through these new commercial and marketing techniques. Political authorities show their constant suspicion of fraud in shopkeeper sales. For example, the authorities defend that shopkeepers try to reduce the light inside their shops in order or for hiding the imperfection of textiles. This was a constant conflict between authorities and shopkeepers. Sorry. Well, as a consequence, finally, shopkeepers create this new merchant guild in 1764, Gremio de Mercaderes de Vara, and they could defend better their interests.
Excuse me, you have only 2 minutes more.
2 minutes? Okay. Well, I go very, very quick. In the second half of the century, we can define this process develop in a different way. We can confirm that there was a process of democratization of luxury in the city of Valencia, prefer design rather than durability, as I said, but also a process of specialization in the textile supplies. For example, the creation of different types of shops with different type of textile supply according to the nationality of the shopkeepers. Also the complementarity among different retail trade circuits, for example, and the introduction of new fashion goods from other parts of Europe and even from Asia. And in the shops, we can find other fashionable objects to dress the body and the house, not only textiles. Well, we can see this evolution in textile trade, where the vegetal fibers are substituting the animal fibers. For example, linen and cotton substitute especially wool. And well, I'm very quickly to finish my presentation. And a process of consolidation of these fixed shops in the 18th century. Well, that increased, to sum up, that increased competition in the Valencian textile market, and it generated a decrease, it's my opinion, a general decrease in the prices of textiles. That it's a key factor to understand this democratization of luxury. We can see in these figures the evolution of prices, especially in the second one, that show that the prices of basic products as wet increase, multiplies for 3 in 1 century, and the prices of textiles, wool, linen, and cotton I don't have information for silk, increase or were more stable. That at the end generated a increase of purchasing power of the middle and lower classes of the Valencian society. I'm moving very quickly to closing remarks. I want to say that I think that I showed that there was a mature consumer society in the 18th century Valencia, and shown in an adaptation of textile supply to the new consumption patterns. A process where shopkeepers were the main actors that in the first half of the century diversificate their supply, and in the second half develop an specialization. Shops are a factor of economic and social modernization in the 18th century Valencia, or in pre-industrial Valencia. We saw commercial growth and the rise of bourgeoisie, retail transformations and new spaces of consumption, and a consumer revolution or consumer evolution in a declining urban economy. I use the same words that the article of Bruno Blondet and Ilja Van Daan, because it's important. In this case, for example, as I said at the beginning, fashion and shopping was we have to ask if fashion and shopping were an economic engine, because, for example, in the case of Valencia, fashion was a key factor in the decline of the silk industry. And as a main conclusion, we have to understand that retail and consumer changes do not mean a growing economy, as we can see in the case of Valencia. Well, I finish here my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry because my English is not so good as I would like, and thank you.
Bravo. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for your very, very interesting presentation. You offered us also economic aspect of the full production. And we are going now to Professor Klaas Nyberg, who is professor of fashion studies at the University of Stockholm, and he has been the former director of the Center for Fashion Studies in Stockholm. Nice to meet you, because we are both of us belong to Academia Europea, but we have not seen yet because of this pandemic. So please, and for the rest of our public, I would like to remind you that you have to use, if you want, the chat to ask, to put your questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for this possibility. I try to show my PowerPoint here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I just put my clock on here. To this interesting symposium, in spite of the terrible COVID-19 restrictions. It's amazing that we can have this exchange of research ideas under such circumstances. I would like to present a paper about international fashion in the periphery. And I'm interested in the way that fashion intermediate in early modern time to especially the north.
Excuse me, can you speak nearer to the microphone, please?
I don't think actually. I have a very...
Yes, it's better. It's better now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I would reflect a bit on impulses of international fashion to the periphery, and then turn to this more specific role of the state-sponsored textile manufacturers. Next, please. The question it's an overreaching question, so it's more an approach than a specific problem of investigation. What I ask is how was international fashion implemented in early modern Scandinavia, seen as a periphery. But we should be aware of that in spite of the very small populations on a very huge area, early modern Scandinavia was the international center for refined copper production in the 17th century, and was the center for international bar iron production in the 18th century and also the late 18th century. And that relates to textile because it created a kind of growth of international merchant communities in the Scandinavian peninsula. And in Sweden, Finland specifically, Finland belonged to Sweden up to 1809 before it got conquered by Russia. But we talk about staple cities like Gothenburg and Stockholm, and in some sense also Turku in the Finnish part. Smaller cities like Malmö and Gavle was also important according to these international merchant communities. Next, please. As a quite new fashion scholar, I actually depart from economic history at Uppsala University, but got this position in 2013 because of my interest in textile history. And I'm pleased to have a chair in fashion studies, but it's also has also widened the approaches a bit. Next, please. Thank you. And it's a very overwhelming discussion today in the field of fashion studies, what fashion actually is. And a lot of research is done on modern conditions, but there are also a quite wide range historical discussion about fashion in the early modern context. And it's quite common to relate to the French context in the late early modern period, also the Spanish court context in the first part of the early modern period. But roughly speaking, we are talking about how fashion was spread from this French context to the peripheries. And we had in the Swedish-Finnish context, as well as in the Danish context, quite a lot of intermediaries between Paris and the Swedish city of Stockholm. That was the kind of core of these impulses. Due also to economic policy that placed Stockholm in the center of economic policy since the 17th century. And we had French fashion in the building of interiors. We had a lot of French impulses in art and other types of clothing, fashion, and decoration of French architecture interiors. So it's very much about the French in the 18th century, and there is a rebirth of these impulses in the early 19th century when the early modern institutions are still left in urban courts up to 1846. So the institutionally modern society depart from mid-19th century in this Scandinavian context, but of course these institutions were in some sense anachronistic after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But there was the French fashion influenced a lot, for example, the early fashion magazines. But I don't speak so much about them because they start to make sense in the end of my period discussed here. Next, please. I say next, please, because there are a lot of lines coming up here, up to one more. Thank you, stop. The early modern fashion influences that I'm interested in relation to the state-sponsored manufacturers relate to these general aspects of fashion discussed among early modern scholars studying fashion more specifically. And we talk about sanctuary laws, European courts, fashion plates, etc. Smuggling is very important in the Scandinavian context. For example, it came a lot of those worsted things that we discussed yesterday from Norwich were smuggled in via Norway to the Swedish context. And it faced, on the one hand, the central regulations, but there were also clothing regulations in local communities that related to international fashion and puts ban on it, and is an important income source for studying consumption. But that's not the topic here. I have also a huge interest in guilds and so-called hallmark courts in relation to intermediation of international fashion. But next, please. The question I pose here, thank you, stop, is spread out in several works. Before I was planned to present about the textile fashion and early modern idea of credit. I have been a lot in bankruptcy studies, but we had to publish that volume last year. So I turned to the next study in this project of luxury fashion in early modern Sweden, Finland, to present the framework of this state-sponsored manufacturers, but it was a bit limited space here, so I couldn't develop what is called study 2 here, a forthcoming edition, what this direction of the Swedish production in state-sponsored manufacture actually meant in the Scandinavian context. I can also mention that I have been collaborating with Elisabeth Staven of Hedemark, that some of you might know from as the head of the textile department in the Nordic Museum. She published a catalog over the so-called Burke collection in 1990 in combined Swedish-English edition that presented mainly international worsted and a lot of French woolen as well. And after some time, when I came into fashion studies, we're starting to collaborate around the three big Swedish collection in production of international textiles. And that was published in Swedish in a catalog 2015. And we will re-edit this edition focused on the mid-18th century and present a more problematized oriented the version in the future here. So this will be the forthcoming study of this project and the final, so to say. Next, please. Now you can put some next again. One more, thanks, stop. The building up of this state sponsor manufacture legislation is a widely discussed topic in Scandinavian historiography. But that kind of contributions are important sources, but the way to problematize it is quite outdated today. So very little has actually been published in English. So this is what we are going to do now together with update primary studies as well. But the system started to be created in the 17th century, but that became only paper constructions. So state-sponsored manufacture system, Colbert-like, if you like, and came after the loss of the Great Nordic War when Sweden became very poor and started trying to develop the inner part of the industry and international trade. This also became interesting again because of the new approaches in global history. This was mainly outlined as a national phenomenon in previous historiography. So today we look at it as a part of the international development of colonial wares, imports, migration, etc. It was mainly a system for production of advanced international textiles, but also included other types of wares regarding fashion consumption, like fayances and porcelain. It's also related to the East Indian context, but not as important in that context as Denmark are, for example. What was created as a framework around it was what is called Hall regulations. That was a legislation. The 1722 concerned only the use of woolen that was organized in guilds at the time. But 1739 was the breakthrough for the state sponsor manufacture and forbade this labeled branches to be organized by guild. It was very hostile against guilds and forced guild masters to become workers in the hallmark court-run legislation. They performed the legislation, so to say, and the hallmark regulation of 1770 was even more hostile against the workers, but was in other senses just a repetition of the 1739 legislation. The hallmark courts overlooked the workers and registered them for every year for every firm. At the same time, they also registered the production of international textiles, specifically here, in relation to state legislation of very high detail. We will come back to that. It was no, go back, please. Thank you. No, not all of them. Thank you so much. It was also a central office like Julien Villain talked about yesterday for the French context. It was the manufacturer office up to 1766 crisis and went to this function went to the Board of Commerce after the 1766 crisis that originated in the Dutch crisis of 1763, and that also meant that whole this system became reformed to a more delimited type of its former character. It became more according to this the label of this part of the session. It became more commercial in its strategies and supported more those qualities that was actually possible to sell in the quite limited Scandinavian market. It was a huge effort to increase fashion and international quality before 66. Was a huge migration supported by the manufacturer office of almost formally 4,000, a bit less than 4,000 textile experts and artisans mainly from the Rhineland, but there were many more in reality. It was also a system of wool breeding, trying to reach merino wool qualities in the so-called wool estate, Schäferistaten, a German construction. So it's not only French, it's also very much inspired by German small regional manufacturer legislations. There was another institute, was the so-called spinning districts, where the Manufakturkontoret and later the Board of Commerce forced paid commissioners to organize big spinning districts in different parishes. And this is an enormous amount of data collected in this system. And when it was as big, in the biggest phase, it covered around 6,000 households per year, where we can see the name of the household responsible and the spun amount of mainly of worsted yarn. And combined with the Swedish population demographic high quality material, this is an internationally unique source for studying spinning in reality. There are a lot of source criticism problems within studying this, but it's incredible. Finally, there are some very important and interesting financial institutions around these activities on different levels, all concerned with fashion issues. The Manufacture Fund and others supported more general experimental aspects, but after 1766 and the crisis for this older part of the legislation and institutions, the system concentrated on the discount financial support to assist in selling textiles. And I present a lot about that in the mentioned book, the first study of this project. Next, please.
Excuse me, you have only 4 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Thank you. Then I just would like to say that the system concentrated in the development of silk and woolen, and in the late period, in the end of the 18th century, it concentrated on traditional woolen that had been refined and developed in different types of innovations that we discussed yesterday. Next, please. This is an example of how regulated the international fashion was in the system. This is 1751 ordinances relating, talking about the qualities in worsted. Next, please. The general outline you find in the diagrams that I have been presenting in the internet. We can just go through it. Next. So we have, here we see that it is state-sponsored manufacture replaced import, but produced lesser than was imported in the 17th century. Next, please. We also see here the coarse qualities represent the military demand, the red lines, the civil market demand, and the fine qualities increase all over the century. Next, please. It was very related to international fashion, as we can see in the collections. Next, please. What is interesting here that it did only pick up some worsted quality in this in a very wide range of new draperies. And I'm wondering in the final study, why did they pick up these qualities specifically? Next, please. And we can see in the collections also what these different qualities within the system looked like. Next, please. We'll have the same pattern as worsted also in silk. Next, please. It turned to very much of brocaded textile till more plain and cheap qualities. Next, please. Next, please. And you can also see the small flowered qualities in the silk coming in the late 18th century. And here we see the very big diversities in the prices. Next, please. One way to study this finally is to relate it to paintings. And I just, next please, added some examples of these types of, next please, examples of these types of studies, how we refer what we see in the paintings to what was produced and how these state-sponsored manufacture production actually can have influenced the taste and qualities used by noble and higher middle class people. Next, please. Next, please. And the conclusion is of this kind, that a lot of institutions developed, but a few resisted the turn to the very difficult times of the late 18th century, and that went over to the 19th century and became successful in the long run. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And you offered also a very interesting legislative and institutional aspect of the wool production in your area. And now we are going to Aris Kafantogias, who is a doctoral assistant and lecturer at the Department of Economic and Social History at the University of Vienna. I am very glad to see Aris, who was a student of us in Athens, and now he will very soon end his doctoral PhD.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Right now I cannot see you, but I don't know if that's a problem.
We see you.
Okay, great. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the scientific committee of the conference for accepting the proposal and inviting me to present the findings of my research. I would also like to thank the people in the organization of the conference for managing to carry out such a difficult task in these challenging times. The topic of my presentation today is the consumption of clothes and accessories of the middle and lower middle strata of the Viennese population in the period 1760-1823 and its relation to fashion. Before I get into the subject of my presentation, I would like to briefly describe the theoretical and historical context in which my research is embedded. Many researchers of consumption in Europe in the early modern period have pointed out the integral and progressively more important role of fashion in consumption in the period. According to Maxime Beck, in the 18th century, fashion became the main criterion for consumption for broader social strata. Fashion was inextricably linked to the fundamental characteristics of European consumption in the period, as described by Frank Trentman, namely variety, novelty, speed of change, the prevalence of visible and immediate forms of consumption, the availability of goods to a considerably broader consumer base, and of course the ability to exercise individual choice. As fashion became an industry that drove demand in a greater part of the population, it was associated with commercialization, accessibility, the public domain, knowledge, and of course female consumer behavior. Neil McKendrick and Jan de Vries, in their influential theories on the development of consumption in the period, the theories of the consumer and industrial revolution, stressed the importance of women as consumers in their arguments, especially working women who possessed their own income and consumption capability, and brought new desires and tastes in the consumption of the household. In accordance with the trickle-down model of diffusion, McKendrick also identified a subgroup with particular importance for the dissemination of fashionable consumption, namely domestic servants who would constitute a link between the consumption habits of higher and lower social strata. Vienna in the period 1760-1823 constitutes an interesting case study. This was the period of the emergence of Viennese fashion. Dress in Vienna in the 18th century was strongly influenced by the dominant fashion centers, London and most notably Paris. New developments in fashion were adopted slower in Vienna, and fashion also changed at a slower pace. But the indirect consumption of fashion through illustrations and publications from abroad served to expand fashion consciousness to a great part of the population. This resulted in the creation of a separate Viennese direction in the first decades of the 19th century, especially in the years after the Vienna Congress, which stimulated the production of clothes and showcased the Viennese products. This was depicted in the development of the number of tailors in the city, which rose greatly in the first half of the 19th century. A critical development for the establishment of Viennese fashion was also the publication of the first Viennese fashion magazine, the Wiener Modezeitung, in 1816. Despite certain instances of crisis, this was also a period of growth for the Viennese textile industry, particularly the manufacture of silk and cotton fabrics, a great part of which was concentrated in Vienna and the surrounding region. States' efforts to localize the production of fashionable goods were combined with the gradual liberalization of the circulation of products and the expansion of retail trade for textiles in the period, which contributed to a stimulation of consumer demand. My study concerns the expanding middle and lower middle strata of this Viennese population. At one end of the spectrum, we have journeymen, milkmaids, and even wage laborers who own just one suit or dress. And on the other, we have merchants, master craftsmen, as well as higher public employees and their wives, who apart from several different suits or dresses, owned a house and could also employ servants. As you can see, the main source of my study are the probate inventories of this part of the population, which were compiled by experts appraisers, and they listed the, I'm sorry, is it okay now? I pressed the wrong button. I'm sorry. In the sum, I have amassed a sample of 300 inventories of this part of the population, 72 of which are servants' inventories, 41 female servants, and 31 male servants. I have divided this group of servants into aristocratic and common servants. This high and low you see in the parentheses are the codes you will see in the tables. The group of aristocratic servants is very diverse, as it encompasses individuals in different ranks who performed a wide range of tasks, from personal servants and secretaries to even cooks or coachmen. This was also, in general and overall, a wealthier part in comparison to the general population. The group of common servants is more homogeneous regarding both the social status of its members and their occupations, as well as they were mostly cooks, waiters, or they were simply mentioned as servants. And they also represented an overall poorer part of the population. As regards female servants, I have also separated the working women. So I have an analysis for the whole female servants, including wives and widows of male servants. And then I have separated in my analysis a part for working women. Domestic servants constitute a significant group in Viennese society in the period, not only because of the great number of servants in the city, but also because they were at the forefront of the discussion on consumption, fashion, and appearance in the period. At the end of the 18th century, certain female servants, the Stubenmädchen, namely higher rank domestic servants, were portrayed in brochures, pamphlets, and satirical works as fashionable consumers, as trendsetters who were even imitated by their employers. Their dress was compared to that of their employers and was associated with their morality. They were accused of seducing men in order to be able to afford the opulent dress, of stealing from their employers, and of generating the need for such opulence in other women. These discussions, which continued in the following period, were not unique to Vienna. The use of female servants in order to make statements on appearance and morality, and the implicit associations of these arguments were familiar to the audience and constituted part of the broader discussion on luxury in the 18th century. So, my study investigates the relation of the consumption of clothes of this broad part of the Viennese middle strata with fashion. It examines the principal fashion changes in the period and documents the process of the emergence of the Viennese fashion. It places the focus on the consumption of domestic servants and compares the number, value, quality, condition, and the particular features of their clothes to the Viennese middle-class population. It examines their role in trickle-down processes, namely if they could function as intermediaries or even trendsetters for this group, and investigates the material basis of the arguments about their significance as fashionable consumers. In my presentation, I will concentrate on female servants, and I will present the general trends which can be observed in the tables and diagrams I have submitted in my paper, and I will only mention specific details of particular importance. The initial glimpse into the wardrobes of the sample shows that throughout the period, female aristocratic servants owned more and more valuable clothes on average than both non-servants and common servants. And even though they were wealthier, they devoted a greater percentage of their wealth to their clothes, which indicates that they invested in their appearance and prioritized their dress over other possessions. I want to highlight the percentage, the numbers, so you can easily spot them. Here's the mean number of clothes and mean value of clothes. And here we have the comparison with non-servants and common servants. And this is true for all periods, as you can see. On the contrary, common servants possessed fewer clothes and accessories on average than non-servants in the 18th century. And even though this trend is reversed in the 19th century, the value of their clothes remained low. As you can see, they possessed a bit more clothes on average, but their value was much lower. There was also a significant gap in the mean number and value of clothes between aristocratic and common servants in all periods. In order to observe the influence of fashion in their wardrobes, we must delve deeper in the analysis of the inventories. Because of the construction of the sample, only general structural changes in dress can be observed, and not the specific changes in 1 or 2 annual fashion cycles. The main structural difference in the period is the gradual adoption after the turn of the century of the one-piece dress, the chemise, in place of the dress comprised of the gown, the skirt or petticoat, and the bodice. Aristocratic servants were the first to make the move towards the one-piece dress in greater numbers. Non-servants also transitioned, but evidently slower. As you can see, aristocratic servants owned most one-piece dresses in the period, and non-servants also followed suit. The mean number of one-piece dresses between these two groups was comparable in 1823. However, aristocratic servants possessed a greater number of overgowns, which were worn over the chemise and with which they could differentiate their appearance, as you can see right here. Common servants never seem to have adopted these items to the same degree, as their appearance remained in the previous form of dress, namely the skirt and the corset. An important item which constituted a particular element of the Viennese fashion in the 19th century was the short shirt or chemisette. This garment was supposedly introduced to Viennese fashion by the servants and is considered to have moved up the social scale. An indication of this process might be the presence of these items in the inventories of both aristocratic and common servants. Zooming further into the specific descriptions of female dress, we can observe the transition to different types of dress in the period. The middle strata gradually adopted a less elaborate silhouette and simpler forms of outer garments. Since the middle of the 18th century, panniers were gradually confined to the formal dress of higher social strata and the nobility. This is also reflected in the sample, in which only 5 such items in total are recorded. A type of dress that exemplified this trend was the contouche, or robe à la française, which was initially used only as a dressing gown, but was steadily inserted in female public appearance as a dress worn in promenades and also in church. The contouche appeared in the inventories of aristocratic servants and non-servants in the first period, though not in comparable numbers. In 1783, the contouche was found in greater numbers in the inventories of common servants than in those of other groups. As you can see, they initially appear here, and then in the next period, they are found in greater numbers in the inventories of common servants. The lower mean number of the contouche in the inventories of non-servants and aristocratic servants should be attributed to the popularity of another type of dress in the period, the commode, which was an informal female morning dress. In the inventories, this item described a type of gown that was characterized by an artificially billowed back. The commode should be associated with the robe à l'anglaise, to which the silhouette with a billowed back conformed, and which was considered a semi-formal or informal dress. As you can see here, we have introduced the commode to the dress of the Viennese servants and then to the non-servants. Additional items worth mentioning are the Nelson in the inventories of aristocratic servants and the Spencer. The Nelson was a type of overcoat. It was a fashionable garment at the turn of the century, named after Admiral Nelson, who visited Vienna in 1800, and was considered a popular figure due to his victories against the French. Its presence in the inventories reveals that aristocratic servants followed the latest fashions rather closely. The Spencer, as an item of female dress in the period, was a close-fitting jacket with long sleeves that reached just above the waist and originated in England. Therefore, the presence of these items in the lists reveals not only the influence of English fashion on Viennese dress, but also the appeal of England in contemporary Viennese culture. And here you can see 2 illustrations of that circulated in Vienna in the 18th century. The first one is a robe à l'anglaise in 1787, and then we have the transition to the chemise in 1798. French and later English fashion affected female dress, especially until the start of the 19th century. Throughout the period, female aristocratic servants adopted the latest trends to a greater extent than other groups, as they possessed more, and in certain instances, significantly more pieces of the fashionable garments in the periods in which they appeared. They were also the first to move on. Non-servants also followed the latest trends, though not to the same degree, while common servants lagged evidently behind. The mean number of the basic items that comprise the appearance is important because it can denote the capacity for combination, differentiation, and change which constitutes a fundamental prerequisite for fashionable appearance and consequently for the ability to play the role of trendsetters in a society. Aristocratic servants were the group with the greatest capacity to change and combine different pieces of clothing. However, it is certain that their wardrobes could not be compared to that of their employers, and it is doubtful if they could approach that of the bourgeoisie, whose wardrobes included regular changings of morning and evening dress. This is also evident by the absence of dresses or suits described as formal or festive in the inventories. Garments at the time were fashionable not only because of their cut, but also because of their fabrics, patterns, and decorations. Concerning the fabrics of their outer garments, cotton was the main fabric of outer garments of common servants throughout the period, while silk was the primary fabric of all other groups in the first three periods. In 1823, cotton overtook silk in the inventories of female aristocratic servants, while in those of non-servants, the relation between the two fabrics was more balanced. The dominance of silk in the inventories of aristocratic servants should also be associated with the material of the clothes of their employers, who could hand down pieces of clothing to their servants. However, this is not a trend necessarily indicative of fashion change, as silk never went out of fashion in Vienna in the period. Apart from silk, the most common fabric of outer garments in all groups in 1823 was cambric, followed by percale and taffeta. And here we can see some printed, some sample plates with printed cambric in the period. This came from manufacture in Bohemia in 1820, and it represents printed cambric in plain weave. According to the engravings of the Viennese Fashion Magazine in 1822, these were not the most fashionable types of fabrics that year. However, there are certain points in which the descriptions in the inventories and in the fashion magazine converge, namely the presence of silk in the inventories, which was the main fiber for many of the fashionable fabrics, as well as the presence of percale and taffeta. And here we can see some engravings from the Viennese Fashion Magazine, where in the one side we have a dress made of atlas duntuch of barège, and then we have an overgown made of grotten-apple, again a silk fabric. These similarities across the sample suggest a certain degree of uniformity in fabrics, which should be attributed to the prevalent fashions. In general, the Viennese followed fashion. The garments and fabrics of the dress conformed to popular trends in the period and comprised a rather homogeneous ensemble, which denoted that consumption of clothes was done according to general fashion directives. Patterns and decorations in female outer garments were not found in great number in the Viennese inventories. Throughout the period, only the clothes of aristocratic servants, and particularly of working women, can different patterns in adequate numbers be observed. Needlework, stripe patterns, flower patterns, or chiné patterns characterized at least a small part of their outer garments. Non-servants also owned few such items, while in the clothes of common servants only fur or wool linings can be observed. This observation runs to a degree contrary to the argument that poorer people adorned their garments with decorations in order to make them more fashionable. In the works that criticize female consumption in Vienna in the period, an essential part of the supposedly opulent appearance of female servants were their accessories. Apart from the fashionable cut and expensive fabrics of their garments, the dress of the Stubenmädchen was completed with bonnets, neckerchiefs, and white silk stockings. The mean numbers suggest that across the sample, women possessed multiple bonnets. This was necessary for accessories that could come in different styles. As you can see, bonnets were found in all groups and in fairly great numbers throughout the period. Bonnets were evidently fashionable garments, as the illustration in multiple occasions in the engravings of the Viennese Fashion Magazine indicates. Fashion changes in bonnets did not concern mainly their material, but their style and decoration. Nevertheless, all groups in the period, to various degrees, owned silk bonnets. All groups also possessed comparable numbers of scarves and shawls, which became more prevalent in dress with the adoption of the one-piece dress, as the neck and shoulders were in many cases left uncovered due to the cut of the dress. Shawls appeared in Vienna in 1823. These were popular in Vienna at the start of the 19th century, as an article on cashmere shawls in the Viennese fashion magazine reveals. However, such cashmere shawls were luxury items and were not found in the inventories of this stratum. Aristocratic servants owned adorned accessories and items decorated with different kinds of lace. Though it is also very interesting that common servants also possessed
you have only 4 minutes more.
Yeah, I'm almost finished. Thank you. Though it's also very interesting that common servants possessed items adorned with gold or gold lace or gold thread, as we can see in the percentages here. Yes, in the average numbers here. An example are the Viennese bonnets or Schlepphauben. According to contemporary commentators, these Viennese bonnets, which were popular among the middle strata, were made of gold or silver thread, and they also had gold or silver lace. Such items might have been more accessible to broader strata of the population who could not acquire garments made of expensive fashionable fabrics. The thread and lace of these products was also made in Vienna. However, for most, they were expensive items that could be obtained only once. The emancipation and gradual emergence of Viennese fashion can be observed particularly through the popularity of these accessories, and as well as certain garments like the chemisette, which constituted specific products of Viennese fashion and were embedded in the Viennese fashion cycle. In my paper, I compared the inventory of a much wealthier female aristocratic servant who was the chambermaid of the highest rank to the Empress in 1823 to the inventories in my sample. The comparison showed that her wardrobe could only be compared to those of other aristocratic servants in terms of number, quality, and value of clothes. Though not in fashion relevance, as certain fashionable or imported items like English or cashmere shawls and Florentine straw hats, which are found in her inventory, did not appear in the inventories in the sample. These items, and particularly the straw hats, constituted precursors to the period of great popularity and fashion relevance of the Viennese straw hats from 1830 to 1848. These items also indicate the close relation between the clothing of the aristocratic servants and the elites. Finally, the examination of the condition of clothes in the Viennese inventories provided information on the ability of the different groups to renew their dress and follow the latest fashion trends. Old and worn-out clothes were found in the inventories of aristocratic and particularly common servants throughout the period, while non-servants owned progressively fewer garments described as old or worn out on average, as we can see in the last period. The presence of old clothes in the inventories of servants could once again be associated to the handing down of clothes from their employers. In my paper, I have brought an example of an aristocratic servant bequeathing all old gowns and old shirts to her servant. The term ordinary described the outer garments of female common servants in 1803 and 1823, while it was also relevant for the clothes of non-servants in the last period. This description could mean a plain garment, but it could also indicate the presence of items that conform to a particular norm or fashion, but were not extraordinary or did not have particular features that could make them stand out and bring additional value to a potential resale. It constitutes an indication that female non-servants and common servants developed a certain degree of homogeneity in style and materials of their clothes, which might have conformed to certain fashionable norms. These groups were fashion conscious and their dress adapted to notions of common and relevant. Regarding the wardrobes of common servants in particular, there is little material evidence on which the aforementioned public discourse could be based. Female common servants might have possessed certain fashionable accessories, such as bonnets with gold thread, that could instigate such comments, but their wardrobes did not compare in number and value to those of their employers. The condition of their clothes was generally poorer, and they were also slower to adapt to the later fashions. The dress of the Viennese in the period was evidently fashionable, but it was those near the top that set the tone. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to comment on the final slide here. We can see the dress of Kubernetes, these hierarchy servants in 1775, and then a contrast of the dress to this kind of servant in the start of the 19th century to a much more common servant, a washer, which is evidently more fashionable and more refined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting paper and interesting material that you offered us. And now we are going through the questions. As I have seen that some questions have been answered during the presentations, I would like, but all the audience have not access to the questions. I would like to process with the first paper, and I ask the colleagues that asked Pascale and Moïra, that is Styles, Kafantogias, Styles and me, Kafantogias, Villain, and Nuremberg. So please put in summary your questions. And if you can, Pascale and Moïra, answer in summary also, because I saw that you had a dialogue, and this is not very easy to repeat the dialogue. So, Professor Styles, and I will add my question to yours, because it is on the same subject.
Great, thank you. Well, that was a terrific paper. I particularly like the way it combined archives and surviving objects very creatively, and it clarified my own thinking about the rise of embroidery in the 1770s and 80s. Of course, at the same period as you get these waistcoat shapes being produced in Lyon in silk, you find in England the same sort of thing being done with printed cottons. So, and especially with cottons printed with the new copperplate process, which originates in fact in Ireland in the 1750s. So you get waistcoat shapes printed onto pieces of cotton textiles with these same intricate borders. And interestingly, you get the same thing with handkerchiefs or neckerchiefs, which are produced on big pieces of cotton fabric, in usually 12 per piece. Again, the decorated borders are the crucial element in this, on which they sell. So I was interested if there was evidence of that, of either printed versions of these shapes in France, or whether the silk weavers are producing handkerchief shapes as well. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I will add my question, which has to do with the same subject. If you, in your sample, also there are vests, gilet with print fabrics or only with garments. So I will ask Kafantogias and Villain and Nuremberg to put the questions, and then you answer all of them as a whole, because we have to divide the 1 hour that we have in front of us for the 4 presentations. Aris.
I have a question, just a small question about terminology. The question is, when does your research end? And if at the end you can see another differentiation in the terminology? Because for me, the gilet in my inventories is the much smaller gilet that was worn with the frock. And the vest is actually the gilet that you described. And so I would like to ask if there's another change later in the period. Thank you.
Do I answer? Oh.
You need to unmute your phone.
I have my micro.
Excuse me. I told you.
It work there?
You hear me now?
Yes,
Yes. I proposed initially that everybody gather the questions and answer all of them, because we have to divide the 1 hour that we have in front of us for the 4 presentations. It's okay? Okay. Then now Professor Villain for...
Yes, thank you for your paper, for your presentation. I made you two remarks concerning the choice in the products and the prices, but it's okay if you do not answer. My main question was about the implementation of innovation. You described an innovation, the in-shape, but when and how did that innovation emerge? And my question was that innovation imposed by merchant manufacturers to silk weavers? How did that innovation emerge? Thank you.
Okay, so I will first answer for the printed waistcoats.
Excuse me, there is another question by Professor Nieberg who has to put it. It has not been written. But
Thank you. Just a short question. You outlined that this is a late early modern example of ready-to-wear, and this is a very principal aspect in fashion studies, how ready-to-wear develop, and there is a lot of interesting studies coming now. This might be one of them, I think. Very interesting. I just wonder, do you have any ready-to-wear information in your material beyond that it's finished waists? Is it, for example, different sizes and things like that? Thank you.
Yeah, I see now that Daniel has a question for Pascale. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is about the ready-made clothes, because in the case of Valencia, I saw some conflicts. I talk about conflicts between shopkeepers and textile guilds, and there were similar conflicts in Lyon, because, for example, this kind of garment, waistcoat, Tailor Guild said that it was forbidden to sell this kind of ready-made clothes in Valencia, because that was a privilege of this guild. And I don't know, because I understand that there are similarities but also important differences between the context in Valencia and in Lyon. In Valencia, in my opinion, is more close. I don't know. Thank you.
Please try to answer now. Thank you.
It's difficult to be concise with all these questions, but the shortest answer is to Aris. And I understand that vest and gilet and maybe not have the same meaning, or are not corresponding to same garment in Viennese, but I think we can have this conversation after, because I've been also very much surprised by your Contouche, Adrienne, robe volante, and whatever, and it doesn't correspond either with French datation or whatever. So I think we have a lot to tell about this. And then the question about the printed waistcoats. Yes, indeed, we have in-shape printed waistcoats. Also the same with petticoats, and the same with handkerchief, as John Stiles said. And if we have samples of this, as I said in my written we have this kind of printed in-shape copper plate waistcoat in Galliera, for instance. In my memory, I haven't seen printed in-shape waistcoats in France, but in the bottom of my memory, I think I saw empreinte printed. No, the empreinte was the first try for the print in the printing process, and I think I saw, pockets or short prints of in-shape waistcoat. But there is a lot of drawings for waistcoats, for printed waistcoats, and a lot of empreintes in books in France, and it has to be explored in all these sources. Then for Julien Villa, the question is that it is well, what we know is that painted and dyed garments coming from India in the second half of the 17th century was yet in shape. We have examples of kimono, we have examples of waists of mainly kimonos, but we have also examples of bonnet, and we have also these examples of this kind of thing you put on the bed, courte pointe, and in Mulhouse we had courte pointe with the 4 cushions who are ready to be cut and the main courte pointe. So this was existing, we know, through the India exports garments, but also textile for house at the end of the 17th century. Moïra has been lucky enough to find a trade card of the very beginning of the 18th century, and in this we show Abi, who is an in shape and woven or embroidered. So we know for sure that maybe this process was existing at the end of the 17th century. What we don't know, and it is a interrogation I had for a long time now, is if this was a kind of transfer from Indian method to European method, or if this was fencing somewhere in silk places like Lyon, and then whether it was the invention of the merchants or the manufacturers, I don't know. It is something like hen and egg for the moment, but it has to be explored, of course. Then what else in the question? I forget your question, Professor Nieberg. What was your last question? And then as I have done.
I asked about the ready-to-wear aspect of your study. How can you see any more detailed evidence of ready-to-wear according to sizes and other aspects that signal a kind of developed ready-to-wear pre-industry? It's a very interesting observation relating to other findings, especially around female textile production, that early aspects of the ready-to-wear that comes up. I think one of you mentioned that also in the presentation, that ready-to-wear normally uprise in 1830s, 1840s.
Perhaps I can try to answer that one. So actually, what I tried to say indeed is that I'm not sure we can say in the case of waistcoats in shape, we are already on a really ready-to-wear production, because actually they still had to be taken to the tailor to be cut, assembled with another fabric to the back, with the back and the sleeves. So and in that sense, we can also answer Daniel's question about conflicts with tailor guilds. There were not such conflicts because it has still to be taken to the tailor. So in that sense, they avoided these conflicts, still giving this privilege that had a tailor to cut. So they weren't selling really ready-to-make garments that could be worn right away. So I think it is more for a sort of first step towards that production. Yeah, so that answered that. Just, I think Julien Villain had, so the question about the innovation, Pascale answered most of it, but indeed, I am very careful about using the word innovation because I don't think it was a linear innovation. If there is such a thing as innovation, it was rather to include that in their production process and to develop it to a scale that was unprecedented before, but it was also because it was a fashion for embroideries that allowed that they could develop it to that scale thanks to fashion and using this as a tool for themselves. But I think in the chat you also had some comments with which I would have liked to go back on. Perhaps I can, if I have time, of course.
Yes, very short.
So perhaps if you want to repeat it, or should I find it in the chat?
It was about the commercial circuits and the fact that the merchants choose the products for their clients. It was my first remark. And the second one was about the prices and the fixation of prices. And it is a very difficult question. The price did not only depend on the quality of the product, but also on the quality of the client.
Yes, so also it depends what you mean by when you say clients. Do you mean consumers or mercers?
Both.
Okay, so in the case of Lyon, they were very rarely in direct contact with consumers, as far as I've seen. They were mostly using, especially for long distance trade, intermediaries, other merchants, mercers. And in that case, most of the time there was a pre-selection from samples or a design previously circulated. I can say that for, so I don't know about other French cities, but I can say it was almost systematic for the Parisian market and in Italy as well. For textiles that were sent not in shape for previous decades, Italian mercers were also always asking for samples first. So it's not visible from account books of the Lyonnais because there is reference numbers to design, but then it could be their own saying, okay, I'm sending this one with this, according to this design. So it's rather visible from correspondence. And there you can see Italian mercers asking them, okay, so apparently my people here are interested in, I don't know, I say checkered tabby. So please let me know what you have about on this style, or saying, please don't forget to send me the samples early enough so I can make the selection in time. So it was really something, and it's only with the in-shape production in that period that, in the Italian case, I started seeing those commissions without any pre-selection. And the case of the price, yes, it is something I just still have to look into, but it's very difficult also because since they were in relation with mercers, intermediaries, and not consumers directly, the price that I have is not the final price of sale. It's the price that they sell to the mercers, but then the mercers might have put up the price a bit to consumers. So for that, it will need to look more into the consumer side of archives, if I may say it like that. Yeah.
Thank you. We are proceeding now. No, we don't have any more time because we are. We have three more papers to discuss. Perhaps you can interchange emails. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are. Thank you very much. We are proceeding now to the discussion for the paper of Daniel Navarro, and there are discussions also in the chat. So please, Pascale, John Stiles, Vilaine, to repeat in a short art of the questions, and Professor Newberg to put the question, to say the question, please.
Immediately.
Pascale, immediately.
My question voice is focused on milliners, marchands de mode, and I wanted to know if in the French shopkeepers you have in Valencia, you have milliners, marchands de mode coming from France.
And Professor Stiles?
Okay, well, I had a question and a comment in effect, and I thought this was a fascinating paper. I was struck especially by how much foreign influence seemed to shape what was happening in Valencia. On the one hand, it's foreign silk manufacturers are out-competing the Valencian silk industry, which, as you said, was contracting. But at the same time, foreigners seem to be arriving in Valencia and actually running many of the shops, and you suggested there were tensions between French shopkeepers, Maltese shopkeepers, and of course a very large proportion of the stock, the bays and the camlets and so on, were imports. Were coming a lot. I know a lot were coming from Britain, some from France. A technical comment was that I think it's excellent that, unlike a lot of people writing about these issues in England, you actually, rather than thinking about pieces, because piece lengths varied all the time for textiles, you've actually looked into yardage lengths, the actual lengths measured. But there is a problem there because, of course, the pieces varied greatly in size. English bays could be almost 2 yards wide, whereas an English camlet or calamanco might be only half a yard wide or 2/3 of a yard wide. So I wondered if there was some way of thinking about square yardage or square meterage, which is the measurement that we'd use today of modern fabrics. And I can understand that that's difficult because they probably don't give the widths, but maybe there's a case for a sort of cooperation between people doing this sort of work, like in France, in Sweden, in Spain, in England, because actually the breadths of different fabrics seem to have been fairly consistent across Western Europe. And what we need is a kind of shared dictionary. This has been done by Maxine Berg for Indian fabrics, where she had her research assistants go through all the East India Company and VOC orders, which often talk about breadth as well as length. So maybe we should get together after the conference and do something like that.
Thank you. And now Professor Julien Villain.
Yes, I had 2 questions. The first one was about tax collection, but Daniel answered, so it's no, it's useless to ask it again. The second question was about was a very broad question, in fact, about the expansion of retailing at the end of the 17th century. In fact, Daniel answered for Valencia especially, but my question was a very broad, a very European question. Why was it a European phenomenon, that expansion of retailing at the end of the 17th century, especially in regions, in areas which were economically in decline? I think of Anvers, Antwerpen, at the period. Professor Bruno Blondet wrote a paper on that question. Anvers was in decline in 17th and 18th century, and despite this fact, there was a huge expansion of retailing. So my question was about that's a European phenomenon, despite crisis in Spain and in Europe in 17th century. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Professor Klaas Nyberg, please.
Just a very short question about fashion and urban decline. I couldn't follow really your I just missed your argument about in the end about the decline of Valencia in relation to the development of fashion, because we have seen interesting patterns with emerging fashion and urban decline in Stockholm, Copenhagen, in some sense Amsterdam. So I just wonder about the argument if we have room for that.
Try to answer.
Hey, thank you very much. Sorry, because I lost my connection at the beginning of the questions, but referring to Pascale comments that were written, I'm very interested in this connection between silk industry in Valencia and silk industry in Lyon. Because as I said, I think that the most important thing is to understand the context because sometimes the context change everything, because, for example, the political regulations or these social conflicts that create I don't know how to say a background more or less innovative in fashion terms. As for that these studies of Leslie Miller, I tried to get it and read it, and thank you very much for the comment. I don't have references to marchands de mode between the French shopkeepers, because these French families are established in Valencia in some cases for decades. For example, these Zumbiela were present at the end of the 17th century, and they were still related to textile market after a century. It's for that I don't know. There were connections, trade networks, and constant importation of French textiles, but not especially silk, because as I said, that in my opinion, Silk Weavers Guild, Valencian Silk Weavers Guild, defended their interest in a very aggressive way. They were always litigating with shopkeepers to, for example, I don't know, forbidden a determinate kind of textile that is a novelty. And in my opinion, we can see in the inventories a decreasing presence of silks. When I talk about specialization, in my opinion, shopkeepers concentrate their business in other fibers for avoid this litigation that was very expensive. Constantly this court litigation. I don't know if I can answer your question, but this is what I know. Moving on the questions of Professor Stiles, thank you very much for your comments, for your suggestions. As you said, there are some technical aspects that is very difficult to answer with the sources. In the case of these fiscal registers, they only give the information of length and value, and we have to combine these two these two factors, not more. But it's an important factor, because, for example, the yard, the vara Valenciana, is smaller than Castilian vara, and that was a factor of a bigger competitiveness of Valencian textiles, for example, in Castile. That is an important factor, but we have this documentary problem that related with the influence of foreigners or import textiles, the presence, we can say the control of foreigners or shopkeepers over the Valencian textile market is a tradition in all the early modern period. The silk is a different sector, because, as I said, we have this strong guild that defend their interests. The foreigners change it before the French merchants, there were, for example, German merchants, as Antonio Furio knows, for example, and also the presence of Maltese merchants are changed the background in the 18th century, but is the importance or the role of local shopkeepers was reduced, was more or less a third of the total shopkeepers in the 18th century only. Well, it's difficult to explain, and it's different, for example, in Barcelona, that where they control these migrations. Well, I hope that I can answer your questions. And for Julian Bilen suggestions, then related with the tax collection, I try to answer. The problem is that shopkeepers were strongly controlled by the authorities. For example, as an example, the house of the collector of the tax is in the same street where are the shops, or where the shops were. Sorry, is even the control is especially hard over the shopkeepers, and they complain for this. I studied especially the textile supply of this group. For that, I think that obviously there was fraud, but it's not relevant. And this broad question maybe is not only for me, it's maybe it's a reflection for the whole meeting, that why we can find this European phenomenon of expansion of retailing. In the case of Valencia, the question is that at the end, on the last quarter of the 17th century, is not a period of decline. It's a period of recovery. For example, in the agrarian activities, also the industry, and the stimulated a more wider market. I talk about this. I did a reference for the Bruno Blondet and Ilja Van Dam text, because I think that there is an very important idea that is with retail growth is not the same of economic growth, and we can show this process of transformation, of social and economic transformation in regions in decline, because are two different things, in my opinion. Well, I think that is. I don't know if I answer also the comment of Klaas Nieber, this relation because between fashion in decline. I don't know exactly. I don't understand very well your question, but I think that I try to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. It's okay. Very nice. And now we proceed to the questions for Professor Nieberg. We have one from Professor Villain. Please. Can you say?
Yes, thank you. I had a question about the devices used in economic policies, and especially what the practice of privilege granting in use in Sweden too. It was widely used in continental Europe, but did the monarchy in Sweden also granted privileges, for instance, monopolies, to entrepreneurs in order to enhance their businesses? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's depend on time. The first half of the very active period up to 1766, the authorities spent a lot of effort in studying these applications as when they talked about innovations and new types of methods regarding textile production or the preparation of the finished cloth after weaving. The privilege itself was to the entrepreneur, but embedded in the privilege was the right to produce monopoly restricted qualities that was specified in the privilege. You got, for example, a privilege to produce woolen and worsted, but they weren't, the applications were sometimes very specified, but the privileges delivered by the Board of Commerce especially was quite standardized, and that became even more important after the 1760s crisis. So the privileges in detail are not studied yet. There are a huge amount on the local level because the applications were administrated by the local hallmark court and sent to the Board of Commerce after an investigation of the applicant. And then the Board of Commerce delivered or reacted the application. But after, in the end of the 18th century, that kind of application became very standardized, especially with those factories that were some kind of plants consisting of a house or a place. The privilege just followed the building or the estate when it was transformed to a new generation. And Stockholm had terrible death rates in the late 18th century. So the factories changed ownership very often, especially in the late part of the 18th century. That has been explored by Johan Söderberg also and others about the general, the so-called decline of Stockholm.
Thank you for your answer. And now we are proceeding to Mr. Kafantogias' questions. Mrs. Montemezzo and then myself. Can you repeat, Frau Montemezzo, your question, please? She's not here, so I have to read the Montemezzo question.
I can summarize it.
Okay,
it's okay.
Please.
It's okay. She asked about whether the presence of different fabrics has to do with the accumulation. Professor Katsiardi, your microphone. Thank you. If the presence of different fabrics has to do with the accumulation during time, because these are probate inventories, and of course, accumulation plays a significant role. It's certain that clothing had to be replaced at some point. It's not that one person could own for his or her whole lifetime one piece of garment. This happened for different types of garment slower and for different types of garment faster. For example, underclothes were replaced much faster than outer garments. However, there was a replacement rate, and I believe it's especially for more time-sensitive fabrics like cotton or silk, this had to be done. So I don't think it's a question that because these were probate inventors, that they had accumulated the whole pieces of garments that they had amassed in their whole lives. Of course, garments were circulating at the time as well. They were pawned, they were resold, etc. One interesting observation, however, is that worn-out clothing is more a part of the poorer population of the common servants and lesser a part of the other groups. And it is also interesting that in my sample, the age of death is only mentioned in the last period. And in the last period, the age of death, the people that died younger were the aristocratic servants. And they had the greatest accumulation of outer garments and of this fabric. So younger people, I think it's logical that younger people had actually more accumulated garments, because with age, older people did not need to be more fashionable and did not need to keep up appearances in public. Therefore, I believe they could have sold their clothing to get some cash. They could have pawned it. So I think it's the inverse for me. That was the question.
My question is, my questions are, excuse me, what is the representativeness of your research sample? What percentage of the population is included in the research sample? And how the kinds of the textiles have been categorized, and how do you arrive to the comparison of the textiles in a fashion magazine and those in your sample? The first two questions have to do with the methodological questions.
Yes.
What about the representatives of such a material? Because as we know, the registrations that have been made after the death of people can represent only a small part of the so-called wealth, because most of them, they try to hide what the diet had. So, please.
In order to formulate my sample, I took advantage of the process and the way it was done in Austria. Normally, and of course everywhere, probate inventories almost are skewed towards the wealthy part of the population, precisely because for the poorer people, the time and effort needed to document their belongings did not worth it. In Vienna, this was not the case. An inventory was made after every death, even if the deceased had actually no wealth. So it is then documented that, okay, this person died with no fortune. So I took advantage.
Excuse me, may I interrupt you?
Yes.
For each death, because I think that if somebody has died without
if there was no will, for example. Yes, but
not for everybody.
No. This is a two-step process. When the person dies, the city authorities come and look at his or her estate. This is the sealing process. The sealing process happens for every person. It is not only if the person had a will or if it had underage heirs, etc. This happens for everyone. This is a documentation for everyone under the jurisdiction of the city authorities. So if then there was a legal process according to which the inventories and the next step could be taken, if there were underage heirs, if the heirs were absent, if the disease was in debt, if the heirs only assumed control of the fortune only under the clause that an inventory was made, etc. So what I took advantage of is the greater representation of a broader part of the population. So it's not that the inventory population is the same as the general population, but in Vienna it is not that much skewed towards the wealthier part of the population. That's what I'm trying to say. So I compiled a bigger database with 30% of all inventoried in the periods I investigated, and then I made a database with the different wealth categories, occupational categories, and marital status categories, and from that I took this representative sample of 300 inventories to represent the brighter wealth spectrum and broader occupational spectrum. The percentage is about, in this database, the percentage represented is about 10% of the inventory population each year, in each period. How the categorization of textiles is done. The categorization of textiles is very, very difficult because we have a very broad variety of textiles and names in the inventories. And we talked about it briefly yesterday. And the only way to solve this problem and to categorize the main fibers and to be able to present more coherent results was this triangulation process. So what I did was I combined the results I found in my inventories with samples coming from the collection of the Museum for Applied Arts in Vienna. And they have a very broad collection of pattern books and samples. And from I compared the namings, the fabrics I found in my inventory to the names in the pattern books, and I saw what was available at the time in Vienna. This was much easier for the start of the 19th century, because for the second half of the 18th century, pattern books are not they're not that many, and they have not been worked to such extent. But I did my own research, and I found some in the archive, and I based my comparisons for the second half of the 18th century to those pattern books. And that's why I can summarize the main fibers of the fabrics without showing all the variety in the descriptions. The comparisons with the vintage fashion magazine are interesting because the illustrations are shown, and there's also a brief description of what is what. But naturally, these descriptions are not that simple. For example, one dress could have had 3 or 4 different fabrics in it. What I did was I categorized the fabrics, for example, the base fabric, the second fabric, and then the fabric of the decoration. And what I analyzed is the presence of the main fabric. So what was the main fabric of the dress described in its time? And then compared it to the main fabrics of the inventories in the sample in 1823 to see if they follow the latest, the most actual fashion. That is a very brief summary of your questions. Of course, the formulation on the sample and the categorization of textiles, I have to get into much more, but I think it's enough for this question.
Thank you very much, Aris, and all of you. We have 10 minutes more. If somebody has questions or has the wish to add something, please, we have some minutes. If not is the case, then we have the break now, and we wait for the participants of today in afternoon. But please, I say them to send to Letizia their PowerPoints so that we can have the probe, etc. I wish you a good lunch. We are not in Prato, with a very nice taverne. Okay. See you. And very many thanks to Francesco, to all the colleagues in Datini, and to all of you.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks.
See you.
See you later.
See you later.
See you later.